love the serendipity of this because 5 years ago on this stage, I actually for the first time publicly talked about my new passion, how to move beyond the delusion that we need to burn out in order to succeed and live our lives in a way that's more productive and more fulfilling at the same time. That came after my own incident of collapsing from burnout. And after 2 books, Thrive and The Sleep Revolution, and coming back here every year to talk about all that, I actually left HuffPost in August, even though I love it like my 3rd child, and I see here our wonderful editorial director of HuffPost Germany, Cherno, in the front row, and launched Thrive Global, this new company to help the culture shift through a new media platform, Thrive Global, through going into corporations and helping them change the culture. And a couple of months ago, I was asked by the New York Times to review this new book called Rest by Alex Pang, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less. And I loved it. I absolutely loved the book, and I was dying to connect with Alex, but the New York Times has this strong rule that you cannot review a book of somebody you know. So I waited until the review was published, and then I got Steffi's email saying, can you interview Alex on stage? So it was a perfect serendipity, and I'm really thrilled to be here to introduce Alex for the first time to DLD, and I know you'll become a regular because he's like a perfect DLD character. His fields are neuroscience and history, and yet he looks at the connection of modern technology and the way we live our lives with our own capacity to be more productive and more creative. And why I love this book is that it is incredibly needed. We are now in the middle of a global epidemic on stress and burnout, with the multiple casualties costing trillions of dollars in healthcare costs, in productivity, not to mention our own capacity to enjoy our lives. So before he wrote this book, he was ahead of the curve. He wrote a book called The Distraction Addiction, and everybody here who is involved with technology knows what an addiction our devices have become. So there's so much to discuss, but I would like to start, Alex, by asking you, given that the science is in, and you have drawn in your book on neuroscience, anthropology, history, to show conclusively that when we deliberately rest and recharge, we are actually more creative and more effective. So given that we have all that data and that we claim to be a data-driven world, how come that we don't live that way? How come that there are all these unstated assumptions, as you call it in the book, that make us live in a different way?
Well, I want to say first, I am probably the only person in the world, thanks to the New York Times, who is glad not to know Arianna Huffington. But to speak to your question, I think that we live in an era in which busyness, the culture of overwork, have gone from being professional dangers to being public health problems, right? And we now have there are a number of factors that go into this, which makes it a hard problem without making it one that is inevitable or inescapable. So, we have for decades had the model of success being people in banking and technology who make fortunes quickly, when they're young, before their technical skills run out, or decrepitude in the hand begins to catch up with them. We have a global economy that appears to be increasingly interconnected, that places greater demands on both organizations and on individuals. There's also a lot of cultural and philosophical baggage behind busyness. There is the sensibility that only ideas that come from hard labor are ones that are trusted. This arguably goes back to Immanuel Kant, so pretty old idea. And finally, there is sort of the cultural dimension that, when you go into sort of people who work in high-pressure kinds of environments learn how to behave in those places from, from their colleagues, from their friends. And absorbing that culture is a way of learning to become a professional. It's a way of demonstrating your competence, your commitment, particularly in fields where you're not producing a basket of widgets at the end of every day, right? So the number of hours you work become a good or not so good measure of how productive you must be. Now, this is not to say that we can't back away from this, or that all of this is written in stone. In fact, we still have the ability to make choices about how we live, and I think we still have the opportunity to help organizations understand why it is in their interests as well as their workers' interests to begin to follow a different path.
Actually, that's what I found is the most important entry point. When you can show people that performance improves, that the bottom line improves, then you are more likely to get quick adoption. We are working at Thrive Global with Accenture and JP Morgan and Uber, and we can demonstrate with actual metrics the impact on performance. We can demonstrate that performance improves. And that is really, for me, don't you think, Alex, the key to changing the culture quickly?
Yes.
The link between deliberate rest, and that is key, deliberate rest, not just like not working. The absence of work is not rest and recharging, and I'd love you to talk about that. And also, I'd love you to talk about multitasking, because something that all of us do, like some people now think that they can be on their phones texting and also listen to Alex, and I want to tell you, you can't. That you have to choose. And it's perfectly okay to choose not to listen to Alex and to text. But the idea that you can do both is simply a delusion, and it's also the most stressful thing we do all day. Because we try to do two things when we are not equipped to do two things at once.
No, it is well within our ability to do things that do not require the same parts of your brain, right? Part of the problem of texting and driving, or texting and listening to someone else, is that you are now having different activities competing with one another. Now, I think that you can contrast that with other kinds of activities that are incredibly engaging and challenging, but which do not set up that kind of competition. Think of playing music, for example. You have to remember notes, your position of your hand on the keyboard. If you're playing with other people, you pay attention to them. You're getting a sense of the audience. You're harmonizing. You have this incredible cognitive ballet going on, which you're juggling all kinds of things. And yet, you don't sense that as overload. You have a variety. It's a set of different streams that all end up in the same place, having a great performance. And that's and I think that in our daily lives and in our working lives, all too often we have activities that stand in conflict with one another, that compete with one another, either at the immediate minute-by-minute level, answer this email in this meeting, or things at the global level, trying to live our lives at home well while being responsible of workers and responsible children to our own parents.
And it's interesting how athletes are now at the forefront of this revolution, because they have the stats to show that when they deliberately rest and recharge and sleep, their performance on the court or in the field improves. And since it's all about winning, they can actually demonstrate the results. They have real numbers to show that.
Yes. And we have, across a variety of fields, now a century's worth of research that shows that for individuals and for organizations, overwork in the long run carries severe costs. right? You get a little productivity spike, but that tapers off, and soon you have a situation where productivity drops below what it does in a normal 40-hour week. You have increases in burnout. You have people literally leading shorter lives. But we also have another body of research that also shows that doing things like taking vacations, like turning your cell phone off at night, that having moments where we can detach from our work, even if we love our work, make us better able to do our jobs well, to do it for sort of longer periods of our lives, and to be happier at it and to enjoy it.
And as you write in the book, these become incubation periods for creativities and for some of our best ideas.
Exactly.
And in fact, the first product my new company manufactured is a phone bed, which is really a recharging station that looks like a little bed where you put all your phones at night outside your bedroom and your children's phones, and there are little sheets that you tuck the phones in. And the idea is through ritual to learn to separate ourselves from technology in order to fully recharge and return reinvigorated to our lives and our work.
No, I love the way that instantiates the idea of recharging and sort of disconnection, and of course the importance of sleep, which is the subject of your most recent book. So,
but you've also written a lot about how in the past we have role models throughout history, incredibly accomplished people we admire, who can show us a different way to live than we are living currently, when we wear our busyness and are always being on like a badge of honor and congratulate people for working 24/7, which we know is the cognitive equivalent of coming to work drunk.
Right. No, one of the things that my background actually is in history of Victorian science. And one of the things that fascinates me about the Victorian era is that this is actually in many ways a period very much like our own. Or it was a period of rapid economic growth, of political and social turbulence. It was a period characterized by the growth of global commerce and communications networks, a time when it felt like life was speeding up, and that for many people, the only way to survive was to outrun their own busyness. Well, as we'll discover sooner or later, you can't outrun busyness. But there were some people who managed in the midst of this to go in a very different direction. What they discovered was that that by crafting their work in ways that essentially layered periods of intensive labor generally of only 4 or 5 hours, with periods of what I call in the book deliberate rest, long walks, exercise, other things, that they were able, in effect, to be highly productive in those periods where they're obviously working, but also to stimulate their creative unconscious, what we would now call something that originates with what neuroscientists call the default mode network, and to kind of tempt that creative subconscious to keep processing, especially the trickiest part of what they were working on. And so, even while living lives that seemed to us remarkably rich and leisurely, they were able to do things like write The Origin of Species, to do things that we find admirable and amazing, but doing so, living lives that we think are equally admirable.
So that brings me to the last theme that we have time to explore. We approached rest from the point of view of performance. And that's really the easy entry point, because everybody wants to be more creative, more productive, get more done. But there is another area that you explore in the book and that I'm fascinated by, and this is more philosophical, which is ancient philosophers have always asked the question, what is a good life? And unfortunately, in modern times, we've shrunken the definition of a good life down to a successful life. And we've shrunken the definition of success down to 2 metrics of money and power. And as a result, we lead incredibly impoverished lives. And also, it's as though we're living on a two-legged stool, and sooner or later we fall off. So tell us about the connection between rest and giving us the opportunity to connect with a deeper part of ourselves, a deeper dimension that puts life in a larger context beyond simply making money and climbing the career ladder. Not that we put any of these things down, but they are not sufficient for what ancient philosophers described as the good life.
Right. Well, you know, the connection between rest and the good life is literally an ancient one, right? And there was a time, for a very long time in Western history, where busyness, where being perpetually on the move, that was the very definition of idleness, because it put you in a state in which you could not reflect on what was truly important. But I think that sort of the modern interpretation of this is that while rest is important for doing good work, and I think any of us who love what we do, who feel passionate about it, should be unapologetic about that and recognize that doing good work actually is an important part of having a good life. These are not mutually exclusive things. But rest also is important for giving us time to make sense of ourselves, to reflect on our own experiences, to make sense of our pasts, to understand what is truly important in our lives. And arguably, while many of the most vivid examples of deliberate rest are of highly creative people or Nobel Prize winners, the hardest work that any of us ever undertake in our lives, the hardest creative tasks we ever undertake, is the job of figuring out ourselves. And that is something that you cannot do without time for reflection, or space in your life for contemplation, without rest.
And that's sort of a great way to wrap this up, because if you look at the history of the work you've done, it appears that the idea that the goal of being alive is to minimize downtime came about during the first industrial revolution, when we thought we could treat human beings like machines, and the goal of machines, including the goal of software, is to minimize downtime. But the philosophical connection here is with the fact that human beings are not machines. And for the human operating system, downtime and rest is a feature. It's not a bug. And we are treating it like a bug. So I think with this great room here of incredibly connected people, we can really accelerate the culture shift if they buy into your incredibly well-argued idea that, in fact, when we take time to disconnect, we are going to be infinitely more successful in the biggest sense of the word, infinitely more productive and creative, and achieve all the things we want with less stress and less problems with our healthcare, our relationships, and everything else. So I'm deeply grateful to you for putting together in this beautiful book that I highly recommend everything we need to know why rest, deliberate rest, and going down the rabbit hole of social media is not resting, it's just not working, which is different than resting. And so I want to have you leave us with the last word.
Take rest seriously. That's my last word.
And that's perfect, because that's why Steffi called it rest with 3 exclamation marks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.